Man, did you know that Irish whiskey almost died? Like, as a category, or at least temporarily. Brutal. The story of Irish whiskey is brutal. It's a long list of the English screwing the Irish, and, because that was their hobby. And, or when the Irish government got put in charge, doing a mixture of awesome things and really terrible things for the whiskey industry. And then just world history really screwing everybody over and over and over. So, what do I mean by that? Well, in early days, Irish whiskey, and this is a super nerdy whiskey story, prepare yourself. In the early days, Irish whiskey, just like Scottish whiskey, was mostly smoky because that's how you dried the things that you needed to dry, like grain and other materials in order to, do things with them. But not only that, Irish whiskey specifically had a lot more in common with what we call poitín, or what was always called poitín. You couldn't even get it on the market until recently, but if you look it up, it's Poitin, and it's effectively the Irish moonshine. And they would use anything in poitín. Sometimes it was grain, sometimes it was all grain. Usually it was grain mixed with other things. Sometimes it was fruit, sometimes it was vegetables. It was anything that would ferment effectively. Potatoes, for example. But it was made in pot stills. And so you got this really meaty, hefty mix of ingredients, distilled product, and then sometimes ran through botanicals to make it taste better. And right up until really the 1700s, 1800s, it's when you start finally getting grain-only Irish direction whiskey. But poitín was very dominant in the history of Irish whiskey. So how did it almost die? Well, first you got a massive history of Irish people making whiskey. Farmers, locals, towns, but pretty early on there's big production and there's people making stuff for a lot of people. And then English aggression affected the Ireland the same way it did the Scots, but differently. The England sort of dominated the lowland of Scotland. In Ireland, they almost only dominated Northern Ireland and Dublin area, but anything outside of there was actually referred to as beyond the pale. Like they had a limited impact, and they were sort of fighting back and forth, and it led to the Irish base almost effectively handing England the whole country in the 1601, when a group of all of the Irish lords partners with the Spanish, who were in their own battles with England, and they think, here's what we're going to do. We're going to wipe out the English forces in Ireland, and then we're going to use that as a stepping stone to cross over and take out England. And they land, except for the problem is that the English had been battle trained on how to fight like this, and the Irish were mostly just a whole bunch of war bands, and they just got their asses handed to them. And it led to the Spanish surrendering, and it led to the earls, the Irish earls, all leaving to save their lives. It was called the Flight of the Earls. And they basically that handed England the whole country. England immediately put in landowners and took over farms and basically just dominated the whole country and turned everybody and all the citizens who remained into effectively serfs for the different lands. And then you've got 300 years of these sort of back and forth battles with England and Irish, and the English just being, and the Irish trying to fight their way free. This is way oversimplification, but commercial distilling grows in Ireland. By the 1700s, the Irish distilleries are already massive. Like most of the Scottish distilleries were small, except for in the lowlands. But in Ireland, already you get big production distilleries by the late 1700s. And then, 1827, Robert Stein invents a column still, and then Aeneas Coffey invents the one that's more used, 1830. Aeneas Coffey's actually Irish. And some Irish distilleries take it on. Most of them go, no, we make pot still whiskey. And so he takes it to Scotland, hands it to the lowland guys, and they just dominate the whiskey marketplace. And so overnight, grain whiskey sort of starts replacing both Scottish malt and Irish pot still all over the world and all over the market. Okay, so dong, there's your first death bell for Irish whiskey, grain whiskey. And then right after that, Friar, what's his name? Theobald Matthew. There's a very real drinking problem all over the world, not just in Ireland. And a priest decides he's going to convince everybody to take a vow of abstinence from alcohol. And at one point, 3 million people take the pledge. Now, I don't know if you know how many people in Ireland, but it's not very many compared to 3 million people taking a pledge of abstinence. Now, did they all actually stop or did they all take the pledge? Who knows? But I will tell you, it had a very negative effect on Irish whiskey, as you can imagine. So, bong crap. And then 10 years later, the potato famine shows up, kills almost 1 million Irishmen unnecessarily. I'm not going to go into that. And they lose about another 1 million fleeing the country for other lands. And dong, there's another bell against Irish whiskey history. And in the meantime, they're all still struggling. Then in 1905, grain whiskey gets ruled actually real whiskey. And now they have a direct whiskey competition that's labeled, and it gets even more elaborate. Bong! There's another death bell for Irish whiskey, and they're still struggling. Then, hey, let's celebrate with World War I. And in the midst of World War I, where you limit production, a lot of the distilleries have to close down, Ireland takes this moment to the rebellion becomes real. You have the Easter Rising, where the English sort of like, we'll show shock and awe, and that'll show them. And instead of it showing them, it actually rallied the populace to support the Irish rebellion. And within a few years, you've got a new Irish government. So, bong! And then the Irish government celebrates their freedom by passing terrible trade tariffs on all English products. Well, at the time, England was most of the world, just so you know. And so this little tiny little island is like, we're going to tax all the English stuff. And England was like, fine, we'll tax all the Irish stuff. And overnight, everything Ireland needed to export it just killed not just all whiskey, but a lot of Irish commerce. And then Prohibition. Hey, U.S. So let's stop drinking alcohol in America, which was one of the dominant locations for Irish whiskey to be sold. Bong, there's another bell. And then the Irish decide they're going to tax exports at the same time that the English decide they're going to tax domestic use. So Scottish distilleries are encouraged to sell out of the country, and Irish distillers are punished for selling out of the country. Bong, there's another death bell. And then, hey, World War II. Bong, there's another death bell. And over, it takes, in the midst of all this, you have tax changes and company changes, and it takes what at one point was 1,000 plus craft distilleries all over Ireland, and they just shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink until by 1948, there were effectively 3 distilleries left. 3. And that includes, 4 if you count Bushmills, and 4 or 5 if you count Coleraine and Bushmills. Well, that was a lot of qualifiers. Let's talk about Knappogue Castle. This is a gift from Bryan Lord. Thanks to you, sir, and cheers to you. So Knappogue is a guy who bought a failing castle that was crumbling, and he and his wife, who was an architect, renovated the whole castle and tried to restore it to its former glory. And as a part of restoring the castle, they sourced really great Irish whiskey and put it aside. And then they started releasing really famous barrels of Irish whiskey that they didn't make, so it's more of a white labeling product. And this one is Castle Brands came in from, but this is 14 years in bourbon casks. This is the 16-year-old. 14 years in bourbon casks, 2 years in a sherry cask. So how cool would it be to renovate a castle and use the basement for whiskey storage? I mean, that's kind of awesome. Oh, yeah. So right out, this is just super malty and biscuity. It's not pot still, it's single malt, which means no unmalted barley in the mix. But it is triple distilled single malt. It's butterscotch and biscuits and malt and a little bit of grain. And then a lot of stone fruit and plum. A little bit of like a soft fig. A lot of honey. Oh, and it drinks very gentle but sort of waxy. I think the sherry cask is giving that sort of slight waxy note to the impact of the palate because it's clingy, but it's not clingy oily, it's clingy waxy. Okay. It's soft. It's approachable. It's very gentle. If you poured this for friends and they were just wanting something easy sipping, this would be perfect for that. There's nothing that stands out as like life-changing, but it's just a damn good Irish whiskey. Just right down the middle. No surprises. Cool. All right. We should all have a whiskey castle. If this is what it creates, we should all have a whiskey castle. Okay, so by the 1948, late 1940s, post-World War II, Irish Distillers, who is Irish Distillers Limited, decides that they need to figure out a plan to consolidate so that the remaining brands are not all fighting for dominance and killing each other. And so if they can consolidate and work together, they might have a shot at surviving. Because right now, Scotch is kicking their ass, bourbon is doing its job, and now we're getting closer into the 60s, 70s when like brown spirits start to become unsexy. So in 1966, they convince John Powers, John Jameson, and the Cork Distillers to combine into United Distillers, and then right after that change their name to Irish Distillers Limited, right? And the goal was to combine all of their products into one sort of company. They had the Middleton Distillery down in Cork, and eventually, and no leader when they first combined, by the way. They had no leader because they didn't want to offend any of these companies that were bringing all their products in, but this is so gutsy. Hey, we're all going to work together. We're all going to be one big conglomerate here. And so eventually they find a guy named Kevin McCourt to take over and run the whole thing. And Kevin does a master stroke. Kevin convinces all three of them to close all their production facilities and refocus into one single modernized distillery at Middleton in Cork in Southern Ireland. And they redesign this facility so that it can actually create all these different brands using the same equipment, with different distillation styles and approaches and different flavor profiles. By 1975, they've all been consolidated. Middleton's running, and here was the tough thing, they stopped all sales to merchants. And so there was an entire industry of, like Mitchell and Sons, and a Johnny Walker was a merchant before the full brand, and they would make all this money by buying Irish whiskey off and then releasing their own private labels. Well, at this point in 1975, they end all of that, and it just wipes out the Irish merchant independent market, and it was called bonded brands. It collapsed a lot of them, and then some of them were bought out by Middleton, and so that they could continue. And they decided to put all of their energy behind one brand worldwide, Jameson. And effectively what happens is Jameson, as a brand, saves the Irish whiskey industry because they put that everywhere. Now, I don't know if you know about this in America, but if you travel America, you cannot find a bar anywhere from Pensacola, Florida, up into Hood River, Oregon, no matter how small, that doesn't have a bottle of Jameson behind the counter. They were so damn successful. But in order to do that, they backbenched all these other amazing Irish whiskeys, and they kept them sort of localized and UK released. And so for decades, people forgot about Green Spot and Yellow Spot and Redbreast and Powers and all of these other brands. And think of what guts it took to just backbench everything to try to maintain market share and get mind share of market. I just think that's the coolest and gutsiest thing. Now, the funniest wrap-up to this is they really wanted Bushmills in the north, in Northern Ireland. Bushmills was it. They were actually purchased by an England brewery, United Brewery Association, or not association, but a group, but never really promoted. And rumor was Bushmills was willing to sell to anyone except Irish Distillers Limited. And then they approached them. And so things are going along, 1972 hits, and Seagram's reaches out to try to buy IDL, and IDL, Irish Distillers Limited, realizes, crap, we're not going to sell to them, but the writing's on the wall. If we don't figure out a plan, then we're going to face some sort of hostile buyout. So they negotiate with Seagram's and say, look, we will sell you a part of Irish Distillers Limited if you can deliver Bushmills to Irish Distillers Limited. So Seagram's buys Bushmills, and Bushmills goes, yeah, sure, great. And then Seagram's transfers ownership to Irish Distillers Limited. Just a little side deal over a 4-year period in exchange for a percentage of ownership in Irish Distillers Limited. And that sort of saved IDL. And it wasn't until later that they ended up getting bought by a French company and being mostly French-owned. But the French-owned story is a different story. All I'm going to say is by the time we hit 1978, IDL owns all of Irish whiskey, period, is an IDL brand, 2 distilleries, making, and I wrote this down, 15 whiskeys, 4 vodkas, 2 gins, and 1 rum, and 50% of their sales were domestic. However, Seagram's purchasing interest in them gave them a worldwide platform all of a sudden. And that's the beginning of when things finally started coming back around for Irish whiskey. But that's a different story. If you're still here, cheers to you. I'm really glad you're here.